Hey everyone, welcome to the Sex, Bodies, and Cinema podcast. I'm Jason Good, one of the co-hosts of the show, along with Ashley Rose. This podcast takes a close look at films that explore sexuality and embodiment with the aim to make space for what is, for many of us, a taboo subject. I'm a former screenwriter and director, and Ashley's a former actor. Both of us now work in the field of somatic sex education. You can find out more about Ashley and her work at ashleyelizabethrose.ca. You can find me at somarelating.ca. There you will find my hidden relationship patterns quiz that will help you identify some of the issues we discuss in these episodes. It's free with your email, and you'll receive a personalized ebook that unpacks what came up for you and offers suggestions for improving how you show up in relationships. Go to the show notes and click on the link to take it today. In today's episode, we discuss Stanley Kubrick's 1999 film Eyes Wide Shut, starring Tom Cruise, Nicole Kidman, and Sidney Pollack. The film is about Bill Harford, a Manhattan doctor who embarks on a bizarre night-long odyssey after his wife shares her secret desire for another man. You'll find links in the show notes pertaining to some of the topics covered. I also want to note that we experienced some sound issues in this episode, and around the 1 hour mark or so, there'll be a noticeable shift in my audio. My apologies for that. Without further delay, here is our episode on Stanley Kubrick's Eyes Wide Shut.
They did a bad, bad thing. They did a bad, bad thing. They did a bad, bad thing.
Had you seen that before?
Not for years.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's a great ad.
So do I.
Yeah.
That's the kind of trailer I like.
Yes.
Gives a mood, doesn't give anything away.
Yes.
I don't have any real idea what that movie's about, but God, I'd like to see it.
Yes. And there, you can sense the tension too, which is really great. Anytime you bring in some Chris Isaac, he's good for.
Yeah, I remember when that dropped, and it was like a really big deal because this production had been like, even I knew at that point, even though this is a film I would have watched in 1999, it was Stanley Kubrick. He hadn't made a film since Full Metal Jacket. Tom Cruise, Nicole Kidman. There's all these rumors from set.
So much buzz.
Weird
it was
sex
prolonged.
movie.
And it was prolonged, the shoot schedule.
Yeah,
and
this is the longest continuous movie shoot in history. Not Avatar, not Titanic. Eyes Wide
Cameron.
Shut. Yeah. So I remember that when that came out, I was like, holy shit. What is this movie about? This is Sex, Bodies, and Cinema. I'm Jason.
I'm Ashley.
It's a podcast about films that tackle the subjects of sexuality and embodiment. It's a conversation show where we'll unpack the films from our own perspective as both former artists and practicing somatic sex educators. Today's film is Eyes Wide Shut. The plot centers on a physician played by Tom Cruise, who is shocked when his wife, played by Nicole Kidman, his real-life wife at the time, reveals that she had contemplated having an affair. He then embarks on a night-long adventure during which he infiltrates a masked orgy of an unnamed secret society. What is your history with this movie? Had you seen it before?
I had not seen it before. I had been avoiding it, as I do most of Kubrick's films, which I noticed because of our conversation. Yeah, I think it was a mixture of eye roll plus, do I really want to go there? There's a marriage. And then, of course, there's other attractions. And it would have been a hot button for me, too, because there was philandering in my family and it had just broken up. So there was a lot of, can you trust men? What are people's authentic desires? I think it was too close to home. But what fascinates me is Kubrick usually deals with sex and violence. And I have studied conflict and sexuality. Those are the two main
Sex
things
and violence, your two favorite subjects.
My two faves, man. And really curious why he seems to be a hot button for me. Like, I haven't seen Clockwork Orange, even though I've heard I love the synopsis of the film, and I have seen Spartacus a long time ago. Anyway, I haven't had a lot of Kubrick exposure.
Yeah, well, let's talk about Kubrick for a moment. So
Yes.
Clockwork Orange fits into the category that you described, Eyes Wide Shut, for me. So I have actively avoided that movie.
Interesting.
I wouldn't, as someone who's interested in film history and filmmakers and the great film, so to speak, I've probably only seen half of his movies. Some of them just haven't interested me, but The Shining scared the shit out of me. It's incredible.
It's incredible.
2001, incredible. What an
Right.
interesting movie. Full Metal Jacket is the first half, I'll never forget the first half of that film. The second half I find comes in and out of my memory, but he's such an interesting character. I've read multiple books by him.
Yeah.
About him, I should say. I've read multiple books about him because
Wow.
he's so different. He's this recluse who moved to London and just takes forever and does 100 takes of each shot.
Yes, his technique.
Yeah, and his films have such a strange feeling to them. Yeah, like I've seen Spartacus as well, though that's his one studio film, which he never wanted to make a studio film after that. I've seen Doctor Strange Love, but I've avoided Lolita. I've avoided Clockwork Orange.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he's so fascinating. I remember when this film came out for me, I was starting to connect more with my artistic sides. This is 1999. I was finishing up university and I had gone there as this brash, arrogant evangelical. And I won't go into too much detail, but had like taken like important courses and how I was going to like change the world for Jesus. And in my last semester, I was like, what if I just took a class that I just really want to take? Like, why does every class have to be for some greater purpose?
Right. Just pleasure,
what if I took a class for pleasure?
enjoyment.
So I took film studies, Canadian film studies, and I loved it so much. I couldn't believe people did degrees in this. I couldn't believe you could study movies for fun and have thoughtful conversations about them, and that would be a legitimate path you could take.
Yeah.
And that year, 99, was when I started to like reconnect with my artistic side. So as a young child, was the kind of kid that would like write stories and get all the kids in the neighborhood. We put on shows. And then I hit like 13, 14 and I'm like, oh, life is serious.
Right.
And your education should be serious.
You should be disciplined, right?
And art is not legitimate. So in the evangelical world, everything that was suspicious. If it's
for yourself, right?
Yeah, for the community, for yourself. If what you're doing isn't like converting people artistically, then it's just garbage. And then I started to reconnect with just the beauty of filmmaking and film studies. And
was that ever confusing for you? Like, did it ever shake you up, or was it just so exciting and liberating?
It was just so exciting and liberating for me at that point. And it was Canadian film studies, so the movies were really weird.
Yeah, I know the kind of content.
Like our textbook was Catherine Monk's, what is it, Sex and Snowshoes?
Oh, yeah.
I think is the name of her book on Canadian cinema. And then this movie was coming out. And I can remember being like, Kubrick's really important. I don't think I probably just seen 2001 at this point.
Right.
I'm like, Kubrick, that's an important filmmaker. And of course people don't know, he delivered a cut of the film, showed an executive, Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, and then died.
Yes. It's so amazing.
So it was like,
that's a good exit.
This was his final film.
Mic drop, you know, like.
And I have a very distinct memory of was newly married, and my ex-wife and I were in a young evangelical couples small group that met every week. And I have a very distinct memory of like, we were having a meal, we were talking about, I don't know, going to the movies or something. And I was like, there's a part of me that is really curious about Eyes Wide Shut. And the pastor's wife, who was leaving the group with the pastor, said, yeah, the sinful part.
Whoa! That's so crazy. That actually happened.
Oh, that happened. That was like, and it just like really struck me like, okay, this is a part of you that you can't show. And so you just bury that. And it was years later that I finally did eventually see the film. Yeah, when I was sharing with you that I have a very particular relationship with that film, that was just like one of those strange, adult core memories for me.
No doubt. And what do you remember your wife's response?
I don't remember anyone else's response in the room. I just remember her looking me
incredible,
like with this eyes of disappointment. And then a few years later, I really started to let this part of myself open up. And I was studying graduate school church history and realized there's this rich history, even if I'm within the faith, there's this rich history of art, and that this is a legitimate enterprise. And so started to teach myself film history, and then revisited Kubrick, watched some of his films, watched this film.
And what did you think about him as a director?
I don't recall my immediate reaction to him. I knew he was a fascinating, important character. His films have such a strange feeling to them. So even my relationship with this film, I can remember watching the opening scene when they're in the apartment and just feeling like something is different. And then watching it, over the years, and then again before, this week of recording this, there's something about the way he uses Steadicam that I find, because he's taken, if every shot we're looking at is the 200th take, there's a perfection. Like the opening scene, you see Tom Cruise's character, Bill Harford, and he's looking for his keys. The dance between him moving around the apartment and the Steadicam operator is so perfect. I find it unsettling.
Oh my gosh. Okay. I have to rewatch that now because I wish I had that kind of lens and detail. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it moves perfectly with, so, it's a steady cam. There's an operator on his feet with this rig around his body holding the camera. It's not like a dolly or anything. It's like the steady cam operator can read Tom Cruise's mind perfectly. And that only happens when you've literally spent 3 weeks on the one shot, which no other film would ever do, no other filmmaker. So right away, there's a sense of like, I'm aware of the artifice to this film. Like it doesn't feel quite real to me because of the dance between Cruise and the Steadicam operator. Anyways, so Eyes Wide Shut. Yeah, I have a very particular history with this film for sure.
Wow. Very cool. It's very interesting to me also what other directors say about him, because I think I really related to what Martin Scorsese said, and this is not a direct quote, but just in essence that on first pass, very few people like Kubrick, but if you see it once, twice, three times, you understand the brilliance. Another thing that Tarantino was actually calling him out and calling him down for pretending to add consciousness to things when really it's just, he's got a big hard on for sex and violence. And I thought that was really interesting that Tarantino, he's like, sure, you do a 2-hour movie and your first 20 minutes are your hard-on, man, and the rest are just what you're putting in for filler, so you can say that you're a filmmaker, kind of thing. In the New Yorker. So he came down pretty hard on him. And again, like back to a question around like anything can help. What helps you actually reflect? Maybe what helps us reflect? What adds something versus just portrays the kind of crazy drama that people have going on inside themselves. So I'm not sure where those spaces are, but I thought it was interesting what different directors said about him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I spoke with a kind of A-level director about him once, who I won't name, but he said he really felt like he both admired him, but felt he indulged his anxieties. Like the fact that he requires 200 takes and he doesn't know what he wants and he just keeps shooting it reveals like something else is going on there. It's not just that he's a genius and just that he's a great artist. It's also like some kind of anxiety and
what an interesting point.
Inability to land on what he wants.
Right.
Or communicate it. And Kubrick was lucky enough to be able to have that indulged.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because he was given the time and the budget, and that's what he insisted on, and studios want to work with him.
Yeah, that's really interesting because that might be some of the fetishization that Tarantino's speaking to, like in the behavioral behind the scenes part of it. And it's possible actors can get very swept up in that. I mean, that's a lock and key for method approaches to acting, right? Is like a lot of actors have had a really, like Shelley Long on The Shining, right? Had a really difficult time, and Nicole Kidman and Tom Cruise. It's very, it's the old acting belief that you have to break actors down to make them great, to build them back up in the, in the model of your liking. And yet, I'm sure as an actor, if you've been through the grind and you saw something different come out of yourself, I think Kidman had said something about having to do that one scene that maybe we'll talk about later so many times that something new definitely has to come out. And because of that, I'm sure in retrospect, some actors, even though they might not have enjoyed the process, kind of go, yeah, but I'm fascinated by the fact that it happened and I did that. That's a kind of feather in the cap. And so I could see a lot of swirls coming around some drama around it, which is about indulgence often, like a bit of drama. And it fascinates me how that carries through the stories, the filmmaking process, and the films itself. Like, let's keep an eye on that, track that a bit.
Yeah, it's hard for me to separate a Kubrick film from Kubrick. Like, I'm watching a Kubrick film.
Right.
I'm not watching a Tom Cruise, Nicole Kidman film. I'm watching a Kubrick film.
Interesting.
And their star power is an interesting layer within that. But yeah, I'm thinking about takes. I'm thinking about how long he took to shoot this. I'm thinking about Sidney Pollack was cast after Harvey Keitel was dropped out. And like, those things are coming to mind for me. And that's part of, honestly, the enjoyment, like, because he's such a fascinating character, Kubrick, to experience his films that way.
So he does give us an experience with that inflated persona.
And it sounds like, from what I understand, as Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman have talked about their experience, I mean, Shelley Long on The Shining, of course, had a completely different, what seems like abusive experience with Kubrick.
Right.
Tom Cruise was in a place in the 90s 20s where he's like experimenting and handing himself over to interesting directors. And so he does Eyes Wide Shut, then he does Magnolia.
Oh, he was great in Magnolia.
Yeah, one of
He
my
knocked that out.
favorite
And that's
films.
P.T. Anderson, right?
Yeah. And P.T. Anderson visited the set of Eyes Wide Shut and sort of took some things from how Kubrick works.
No way. Huh.
And from what they've described, Kubrick had some interest in Cruise. Sidney Pollack made the connection because Pollack had directed him in The Firm really recently.
Right.
So Sidney Pollack plays Ziegler, and he's mostly a director.
Yeah, I love Sidney Pollack. He's one of my favorites.
Yeah. And connected the two of them. And Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, from what they've described, just like handed themselves over to Kubrick. Like they just signed off 2 years of their life. They agreed not to work on anything else.
That's an interesting stipulation as well, right? All of this creates mystique.
100%.
It's really interesting.
Yeah. And so they've described themselves as just giving themselves over to the process.
Right. One thing I found really interesting researching the film further was that I couldn't get a straight answer on whether Kubrick thought the film was fantastic or a piece of crap. And I couldn't always get a straight answer of whether Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman loved working with him or didn't. And I thought that was a really interesting layer on the things that we might end up exploring around what's real, what's true or not in the film, what's reality. So again, it's very multidimensional.
Yeah. So Eyes Wide Shut, based on a novella by Arthur Schnitzler from 1926, which was set in Vienna, and it's brought into the 1990s New York. There's a great book by the co-writer, Frederick Raphael, called Eyes Wide Open, where he describes the process of writing the screenplay.
Right.
But Kubrick optioned this story in like the 60s. He'd been trying to get it made for quite a long time with different writers at different times. So this was something that resonated with him early on.
Yeah.
And he'd been trying to get that made. And as we've hinted at, the film was shot over 400 days. It's the Guinness Book World Record longest continuous film shoot.
I found another interesting tidbit that Alec Baldwin and Kim Basinger were runners-up.
Right.
What a different film that would have been.
Yeah, right?
Yeah. Also married, right?
And apparently in the 80s, he thought about Steve Martin.
Yes.
Like
which
there was
seems
different
like
versions.
more edging towards more humor, and Woody Allen.
Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting.
Just he played with different ideas and then finally landed on Cruise and Kidman. This was your first time seeing it. You had avoided it.
Right.
What did you think?
I half thought it was such a great portrayal of what goes on in people's psychologies, in terms of what they think they want, what they truly want, how to navigate learning about their desires. We might have multiple desires that are completely paradoxical. So how do we make those choices? I think it brings up a lot, and I think that's brilliant. And every once in a while, a bit of an eye roll and feeling like, oh, of course, especially with the culty sex scenes and stuff. Those are a bit banal for me.
Mm-hmm. I think that's the
could be part of the point, and I would love to be challenged on that. Yeah, that's
what they're going for.
I want to hear more from you on that. Again, we've had other movies where we can't tell whether the acting's good. I came in and out of thinking that it was well performed. And the moments in which Kidman and Cruise were great were like stunning. So it's not about chops, obviously, with both of them. I got confused because I thought it was about her in the beginning. And then I felt a protagonist shift, but I think they were just setting the stage with the marriage, I guess. But we really stayed with her a lot. The interesting thing is I did watch it with my partner, who's also a sexologist, and we viewed it completely differently. He was like, oh, do we have to finish this movie? He was like, this is not how people are. And I was like, this is shaking me up because this is completely how people are. And he's like, no, this is totally overblown. Like, why is so negative? And I'm like, no, people are dark and insidious things are happening. And if you only knew the stats on XYZ, and we were in completely different corners on it. And so I'm more aware of shadow. He's more aware of like personal light, I think. And which is interesting. And now I think I have more appreciation for it than I ever thought I would. And even if it's not something I would probably want to go back to, I can't see myself rewatching the film. There's several scenes that I think are kind of burned in my brain. So that's really interesting to me, that they'll almost be like interjected thoughts. And I think there's certain cinematic things that crystallize moments where I'll know because I'll just be driving, I'll be doing something that's completely, and I'll just get that image coming up for me. So it has some things struck chords for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you and your partners experience it differently. I think the film intentionally leaves space for us to project onto what's happening. Some of the scenes are ambiguous. You could read them either way in different ways.
Sounds like sex.
Right.
No.
and because Tom Cruise's character Bill he's both active as a character, but also things are just happening to him.
Mm-hmm.
I think it does allow space for projection, our own experiences to interweave with the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're a little more drawn to notice shadow,
Yeah.
your partner notices light, you might experience that differently.
Yeah.
I find what I enjoy about the film, and I will return to it, is so weird. It just has such it's strange in a way that makes me lean forward. And because it is operating at a frequency that I don't know many other films operate at, I don't know that any other film operates at this frequency where it feels like it's both dream, but not dream.
I would say Baz Luhrmann
Interesting.
would be close to that. Baz Luhrmann has more of a carnival feel than Kubrick does. Kubrick has more of like a shadow and light, like like gritty. Baz Luhrmann has more fantastical, like, the early Monty Python art that they used to do and those animations.
Yeah.
It almost reminds me of
Gilliam's animations.
Terry Gilliam, Baz Luhrmann, but I would agree not many. And the unsettling nature is not always part of, like, there's always a bit of a tickle with Baz Luhrmann. There's not much tickle with Kubrick. It's more like, how do you feel about cold hard metal on down your shirt,
Yes.
Yeah, but good point. There's an absurdity and there's a larger than life thing that's commenting on the humanity. That I felt that in several places.
So as I watch it, there's that strangeness to it. And what I appreciate the film is that I can understand why Kubrick wants to explore this subject, because it's this strange thing that we do in marriage and monogamy, and the artifice to a certain extent of that, or the choice to make it an artifice, or the way that we hide, and the masking and the themes. I get why that he would want to explore that, and I don't know that I can put words to that, but seeing some of his other films, and so I feel like I'm joining him on this journey into this subject matter that's dreamlike, strange. So I don't get answers from the film, but it unsettles me in a way that I find helpful. It confounds me at times in ways that I find interesting.
Yeah, and maybe in that unsettling quality that provides reflection, there could also be an aspect of a bit of, taking charge out of our systems, at least being able to discuss some of these things,
yes.
Or, having someone else contemplate them with us in an artistic way. I definitely appreciated all the different things that the character does as he walks through this evening. So we'll talk about that more.
Okay, well, let's jump into this film because there's so much in it to talk about. How did the opening scene land for you? How did you experience that?
Well, we suddenly see this nude of Nicole Kidman, who's striking and long-limbed and everything.
The longest back in film history, maybe.
What a good way to put it, yeah. And so it's raw. And I would think that the viewers interpreting that there's both power and isolation. And I think that's one of the big themes of the movie, power and isolation, because I would think a woman faced away like that has a lot of power with her husband. And we do see that she gets attention from her husband, but she seems completely bored and completely unfed. And so I was fascinated immediately by, she says almost right off the top, "You're not even looking."
Yes.
About the dress.
How do I look?
Yes.
You look great, or whatever he says, and he's not even looking.
Yes. And so I couldn't tell immediately what they were on the edge of, because both seem restless about something. She seems bored and like she's going to challenge herself to do something dangerous. Like she seems way further out than him. She seems discontented in general. And he seems like someone, as long as he can keep up the front, he'll be okay. And he'll do, what's good enough in his relationship and what's good enough for everyone to kind of live up to everything. But I was fascinated by this thing in relationships where we need to accept the influence from the other partner. We need to know that we have impact on the other partner, because she has, all I could see was power, and that she was getting some attention, and there were all these things. So I couldn't figure out why the discontent was so broiling under the surface. But then it made me acknowledge that there's deeper things in relationship with partner signaling, where you really know, do I have power with this person, and where's my power coming from? Oh, he cares maybe he would only care if I wanted to fuck someone else.
Yeah.
But what does he care about genuinely in regards to me? So literally, what is that? The first that's the first minute of the movie or something?
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting that when you think about like how you open a film is really important. And as you're saying, it opens on Nicole Kidman and the way she moves her body as is she undressing or undressing? I can't remember.
She's probably about to put on her dress if
Yeah.
she's going out. Yeah.
Yeah. And her body just sways in this sensual way that is really fascinating. And then we cut to him and he's just looking for his keys. Like the sort of most mundane way you can relate to a partner is like, where are my keys? And the first time we see them as a couple, she's on the toilet. He's looking away and she's asking him, as you're saying, how do I look? And he's not even looking at her. Like, okay.
She does get up off the toilet when she asks that, just so people, you're not even looking at me on the cam.
Right, sure. Thank you.
But then puts on the dress and the mundane versus the sparkle that they have to project in the world and what gets attention. It's another theme that's up immediately.
And we're introduced, this is Christmas time. Christmas lights are everywhere in this movie. Every scene filled with
Are you a little irritated?
Well, it was just fascinating. There's this sort of glow to all, like this soft glow to every shot. I understand it took some special techniques with the camera to make that work because there were so many Christmas lights in every shot. He had initially thought about shooting it. I don't know if you know Barry Lyndon, but they used special lenses and camera speeds so they could shoot with real candlelight.
Wow.
So they were wondering if they needed to do the same in this movie. I don't think they did in the end, but Christmas lights are everywhere, which is fascinating, but there's no symbology. There's no reference to Christmas. It's like the one ordinary thing in the background of all this weirdness, maybe. I'm not sure why it's so prominent, but feels like.
I have some ideas about that.
Great.
Let me know what you think. So I think it's really, really fits because Christmas more than any time, you can kind of be driven off the values that you were intending, like maybe the thing you were trying to do, like family should be about Christmas and the birth of Christ and renewed joy in faith and humanity and all these themes. And we're in malls running ourselves ragged and we might be internally breaking down, but we have to go to the Christmas party with a fresh baked plate of shortbread cookies. And so I think it just adds to the surreal. It's kind of like feeling sad in an amusement park, right? It's got that juxtaposition. And so it felt like, how did Christmas get so commercial? It's kind of that kind of feeling. How did we get here? And so I thought it was a good backdrop, all the twinkles and the celebration versus really what's going on underneath. So that was my interpretation.
That resonates for me. Yeah. I mean, I've had my share of meltdowns over Christmas. That's typically where it's going to happen.
Yeah. I was talking to a Christmas person.
What exactly is a Christmas person? Like an elf?
Oh, what exactly is a Christmas person? I'm a Christmas person, so I can identify other Christmas people.
The season.
Someone who loves the season. And I was like, but you have to take a run at Christmas. And if you miss, it's kind of like being a marathon runner. If you're bad off the blocks, you just won't win the race. And she goes, that's why I start November 1st.
Oh my God.
And I thought, wow, you're even more intense than me. She's very, very creative. I'm very creative. And so it's like there's so much you can create in that month. Don't want to go too far afield, but yeah, there's that feeling of there's a lot of pomp and circumstance around Christmas as well. Like Hark the Angels Sing, like how can we have the big choir? Can we put on the big party with wine flowing? And there's that aspect too, like the party that they go to.
Which is ironic given that the original Christmas, according to the story, was the humblest of stories. Right.
Straw and good intentions and
barn, smelly barn.
Yeah.
So we have that opening scene. We get a sense of the mundane and their relationship. And then they arrive at Ziegler's party, this opulent.
And greeted by Ziegler and his wife.
Yeah.
They get received. And
It's interesting. There's that line where he says something to the effect of like, she's like, who do you know here? Something he's like, not a soul, but she's also there. Like, I just wondered if there's some subtext, like,
oh wow,
not knowing her, not knowing himself.
Wow. Good catch. Yeah.
But then he gets, they go their separate ways and then they have these experiences where she's with, I'm just going to say the Hungarian, I can't remember his name.
Yeah.
And then he's with two models.
Yeah.
And they both experience being propositioned. But as you point out, we're seeing much of that scene from her point of view. She's watching him.
Yeah, we're not in his reality much yet.
We're seeing him encounter these women and try to navigate that, although he never says no. And even when he leaves them, he's like, we'll continue this conversation later. There's a part of him that seems to be playing on the line there. But like we're seeing her watch him more than we see him watch her.
Yeah. It really brings up for me, like opportunism is starting to creep in, like how people use each other and seek opportunities. And if you're not really clear and solid, you can get eaten up pretty quick. That's how I feel that starts trickling in. And that happens, it's peppered through the whole movie, I think.
So then he gets called away to help Ziegler.
Yeah.
And we've introduced to Ziegler, this is Sidney Pollack's character and his wife. They present beautifully and they're welcoming. And then he gets pulled into this bathroom and there's a naked woman who's much younger than Ziegler.
Yeah. Overdosed.
And Ziegler's asking for Cruise's help as a doctor. Now, I just want to just touch on one thing before we get into that scene. The way he's portrayed as a doctor is interesting to me because they keep saying he's a doctor. Like,
oh, it's really reinforced.
Over and
he even
over.
has this weird little certificate in his wallet.
Right,
He keeps
like
flashing.
He's like a private investigator or like a cop or something.
Yeah.
Here's my board, whatever, card in his, and there's this like, I don't know. There's this strange, I don't know if it's a status thing for him, but I also want to say he's just a doctor. Like he's just a general practitioner. It seems like he's not a specialist. But it's kind of
status.
It's his status, at least. He's still low status. At this party, he's low status. I would think.
I wouldn't say that. I would say there's a contradiction in status because it seems like he's got enough to get in. He's got enough to be called into the sanctum sanctorum in the most urgent. So there's a type of power there. Beautiful wife, they're looking good. They're obviously admired and not put down at all. But I get what you mean that they might feel less than or be more confused and maybe not a part of the culture, really. It's almost like there's a culture clash. But there's a weird paradox underneath as well. Like the relationships are not clear. No one's clear with each other in most of these scenes.
So he gets pulled into the bathroom and Ziegler has clearly been having sex, doing drugs. And it's strange that we see Ziegler zip up his pants and put on his suspenders. And then he says she's been like this for 5 or 6 minutes. Which also is telling a story of...
Yes, and she's not covered up at all. She's completely stark, even though there's another man in the room. So there's no actual taking care of. There's just, this is inconvenient for me. And he keeps checking his watch. It's just, will the wife find out? I need to tend to the party guests.
Yeah.
It's really all about damage control around the priorities. You can tell the values and the priorities of the situation is so not about the person.
What did you think when Cruise's character is like, you're very lucky, you need to get help? I experienced that insincere, I don't know if that's the right word, patronizing. I didn't believe him that he was actually had empathy for her in that moment.
Well, I think that's really common with people who have coping mechanisms with substances. That's how most people treat them, to be honest. I mean, I worked on the Downtown East Side for like 11 years, and a lot of people think, you need to stop. Are you gonna, is this really what you want to do with your life? There's a lot of attitudes that have no context, or like, look at you could see her as the mouse in the eagle's nest. I'm not saying she has no choice or that she didn't participate in it and that she's not also gaining power in certain situations, but she's also vulnerable and being used. And there's a lot of structural authority that we'll learn later behind those that have a huge amount of power, money, and influence. So those kind of structures tend to victim blame. And they tend to say, maybe you should be different because you're not fitting in with this whole thing right now. And maybe take care of yourself, like clean yourself up. Like, why are you crying? There's also no space for humanity or emotions usually. So yeah, I think it fits, but everything's signaling. And I think he can kind of see, it's interesting in terms of what doctoring is. I was struck by the fact that he could have done nothing, really. He took her pulse and kind of talked to her. And
he was mostly there for Ziegler, almost to just tell Ziegler she's not going to die.
Yep.
He wasn't really doing much else.
I didn't feel a complete lack of compassion from him. You thought he was looking at it only from Ziegler's perspective? I felt like he was...
I mean, at the end there, what you described on the Downtown East Side was helpful, the way that people talk to people with drugs. What I mean was, in that space, he's tending to this woman, but there's not much he's to do. He's not, he's not doing much except being present and telling Ziegler she's not going to die.
And of course, the optics are terrible because Nicole Kidman doesn't know where he's been after he's talked to these two models. So that it starts to put in a bit of a question.
So while he's up dealing with Ziegler and Mandy, I believe is the name of the woman in that scene, Nicole Kidman has probably drunk too much at this point. She's a little tipsy, and an older gentleman, the Hungarian, comes over and approaches her. There's a really lovely shot from behind where we see her back again, like we did in the opening scene. We just watch him looking at her back.
Backs are really interesting because they're kind of like a rough sketch of who someone is.
Oh, interesting.
You don't get their full thing. They're basically a silhouette. And so they can represent something differently
You
than
can
when
sort
you
of
get...
project
I
what
think
you
so.
think is there on the other
Yeah,
side.
that might be something they were playing with.
So he invites her to dance and is flirting heavily with her.
You know why women used to get married, don't you?
Why don't you tell me?
It was the only way they could lose their virginity and be free to do what they wanted with other men.
What a perspective. I mean, is it altogether false either?
His perspective, or
Yeah.
yeah,
Like that was the terms where you could start to have sex, and that would be acceptable for a woman to be sexual. And but it's quite the hook given
Yeah.
their circumstance. What
Yeah.
did you think about that comment?
I don't know. I found him fascinating. The performances are so strange in this movie. His performance is strange to me.
It seems like from another era to me.
Yes.
And the
his
music.
voice, the
Yeah.
music, the tone, the pitch.
It's like Cary Grant or like...
Right. And so I find myself watching this and I want to ask you, like, is this attractive? Is this, does this work? Even I bumped like when he's like that statement of like, you could have any man in the room. I don't like it when people say that.
Mm-hmm. No, for me, it's not legitimately attractive.
Right.
But if I was on a wounded enough night and I wanted to hear a few sweet things, like I think all of us have that part
Sure.
where we're like, oh, is that really what you believe in me? And if you're feeling vulnerable enough and the circumstances are right, we can
Yeah.
fall like a house of cards. There might be some people who would find that more or less attractive. I'm definitely, everything he was doing was more on the less attractive side for me. But I get it. I've also been taken by things when I'm feeling raw or exhausted by life or an emotion where things that normally wouldn't land might have more influence with me, for sure.
Sure.
I relate
Yeah.
to that.
So the Nicole Kidman's he's attempting to seduce her. We're cutting back to Tom Cruise with the models, who then, as we've said, eventually goes and helps Ziegler. It's
Mhm.
interesting in the scene with the models, he feels his most Jerry Maguire, Tom Cruise.
You're so right.
In that
What a
scene.
cool observation. Yeah.
So he feels fake. He feels like he's putting on an act as well. She's not so much putting on an act as trying to stay clear-headed because she's drunk.
It's true. I mean, she's spinning a little bit in like, another person who wants me to be something. Ha ha ha. A little bit. That's the flavor I get. Whether I'm not sure whether that's accurate or not, but I think she's a bit amused as well because it's just another person trying to slot her in. Whereas it seems like Cruz is still in a place where he wants to be slotted in. He makes a comment that's just sometimes the kind of hero I can be. So he's still enrolling and feeding what the women are trying to see. She's plays with it, but then the way she says husband is so interesting.
Yeah.
When the first time that she says husband,
Which he reacts to. Yeah.
well, yeah, and he goes, oh. So you can tell that their cigarettes are ashed to a different degree, let's say.
Mm.
You know, hers is worn a lot more thin. And I think she's actually the catalyst for all of this falling apart.
Right. So the Ziegler scene ends with him saying this needs to stay between the two of us, obviously.
Boys Club. Yeah.
Boys Club or patient.
Rich Club.
Yeah. Patient physician, although Mandy's not patient at that point. Yeah. What did you think about that confidentiality?
I think that it's a wink wink for people in power. Like, I think once power's in play, you can wag the dog.
And he does say later when she's like, we should send a thank you. He's like, I've taken care of it. Like I've given something back. We cut back to them at the house. And this is like an interesting moment where we get the Chris Isaak song briefly. And they're in the mirror, naked together in the mirror. And about to have sex, seemingly. We have this moment with her looking herself in the mirror. It's just an interesting moment. Like the scenes before, the movie's starting to get horny. And then the two of them, between the Hungarian, the models, Ziegler, and then the two of them come together and we intimate that they're going to have sex.
Yeah. I just feel like opportunism is the ghost in this film so often that just it can feel like a den of wolves or other images like that, where you can feel that these people are fragile and they're a bit, you never know which monster is going to get them kind of thing. And I think it's funny, I'm saying sexuality is basically the monster, but when you say the film's getting horny, it feels like there are things kind of reaching, whispering in their ears. Like it does seem like different things are trying to hook, influence, lure. You know, there's so many tactics around them. They're always navigating tactics. So then you see them alone in their bedroom when there's only two of them. And the ghosts of all of those opportunistic kind of chords don't seem to be able to come off.
Yeah, because she's somewhere else. She's not fully present to him.
She seems very disillusioned. Well, she's also worried that he like had sex with these models.
Yeah, we find out later that she had just thought something had happened,
Yeah.
which she's not communicating.
Well, I don't know whether it's because I'm a woman, but I already was thinking like her. Like I didn't need a reveal for that. I'd be like, I was thinking when they were sitting on the bed, I would not be handling that like her. I wouldn't start making love with my husband, for example. But yeah, it's an interesting scene. And that is one that notably gets mentioned, that Nicole Kidman was driven to the point of exhaustion around it.
That scene. Interesting.
Yeah.
So then it's a really one of the hardest cuts in the film, I found, because so much of it had this, the music up to this point has been quite diegetic, like the music is within the film. And then that scene is when they're in front of the mirror is the first time we get non-diegetic music where, it's the soundtrack of the movie. It's the Chris Isaak song. She glances towards the mirror. She's not fully present. And we fade to black, and then the song cuts really hard and the elevator opens and it's kind of the next day. But we've had a lot of fade and cross dissolve transitions up to that point. And then we kind of get their mundane life. He goes to work. She's at home with the kid.
Do we want to talk about that fight though? Because that fight is really...
The fight hasn't happened yet.
Oh, that's the scene I mean.
The next day.
Okay. So I got confused. So the scene where she's smoking pot.
Yes.
And I thought that was when she asked him, did you sleep with those?
Yeah. So that moment where they're in front of the mirror, that's a withhold. Like she's holding on to that.
Gotcha.
They haven't expressed what happened. They go about their ordinary lives the next day. Then it comes up. I can understand why that scene would have driven her crazy. I can't imagine shooting that scene for probably weeks and weeks and weeks. And you can see her kind of going crazy in the scene.
Yeah,
so
that was one of those ones where I didn't always believe her. And what I had read written about that is that he pushes so that the obvious choices that actors are used to making aren't slotted in, and that it also creates dissonance. So I thought that was interesting.
So it's interesting that the first scene with him as a doctor, there's a beautiful young woman in there with her who's uncovered, which comes up later in their argument around like, is it titillating when you're with a woman and examining her
doing a breast analysis? Yeah.
So after this seemingly ordinary day, she decides to roll a joint, and then we meet them smoking together in bed. And then this is the scene. How did you, seeing this scene for the first time, what came up for you? How did you react to this?
I could see it from very clearly from both perspectives. How from his perspective she was picking a fight, and how hard this character fights to maintain stability in all the realms of his life. So I was feeling a lot of compassion for him. And I also really understood it as a woman, because it brings up, well, for couples in general, we want to know our partners, but we can be really afraid of their truth. And we don't always make time and space to hear hard things. And we don't always know how to process what is actually real for our partners. And we may not want them to have those predilections or fantasies or impulses. And that can bring up a lot of different things. And so we can ping off each other a bit as couples, I think, in relationships. As a woman myself, I related to the conversational script because my partner exclusively works with women in very intimate circumstances as well. And I can understand wanting to interview that sometimes. And I think even women not in my circumstance, and I don't want to make this only about women, because, but maybe you can speak to the other half. But I could see, for instance, someone goes to attend their best friend's bachelor party and they come home. It's like, oh, where did you guys go? Did you go to a strip club? How did you feel? All these situations put us in the dilemma of how honest can I be? What parts of myself am I allowed to be? If I tell the truth, are we going to be able to handle this? Lots of dilemmas like that.
Yeah.
So again, smoke and mirrors, right? Do I tell a half truth and she still gets to know me a little bit, or him or they or whatever? So pretty relatable for most people, I think.
Yeah, so let me just actually talk about the scene itself and then I'll share some of my thoughts. So it's interesting that they needed to smoke pot in order to open up, like for some of those masks, which is a recurring theme in the movie, to come, at least to soften a little bit. And so then she asks about the models and what happened. And there's a bit of an interrogation around that moment, or whether about him, if he's doing a breast exam with a woman, is there some other layer of sexuality that inserts itself into that moment? She talks about the Hungarian and him propositioning her. And one of the things that I noticed was that it escalated in a way that it didn't need to escalate, which resonated as very truthful, because he makes a statement and then she said, "Are you saying a man would only want to speak with me if they wanted to fuck me?" Which is actually not what he was saying in that moment. And instead of backing up the argument or clarifying the argument, they just go with that thought. It's an interesting moment where she's like, essentially, you think you know women, you think you know me. We have all kinds of desires. And then it felt like to me like she was weaponizing by her strange performance, her laughter. She's weaponizing that memory of this naval officer. So this is what she shares with him, that she saw this naval officer while they were on vacation. And they're having a beautiful vacation and feeling connected as a couple and talking about hopes and dreams. And yet she admitted that she would have thrown it all away just to have sex with him once.
Their child, her marriage, everything.
Everything. Yeah. And I appreciated Tom Cruise's performance as well, and how he listened and how you see it landing for him in that moment. Again, it is a strange scene, but we could spend the rest... I don't
mind the strangeness. Yeah. It was kind of the level of truth being conveyed. I think actually hysteria is a really important part of people coming undone when they're losing their bearing. But it was very interesting to kind of see her weaponize that. To me, my interpretation is that's the only thing that would have broken through his wall, was the fact that she wanted something else other than him. Yeah. So I think that's probably why she fed him that line of like, "Oh, you don't think anyone else would actually give me attention unless they wanted to fuck me." And that's when she gets most of his attention, not when she's just in a dress. He's most attentive when he's looking to make love. And so the fact that she wants to make love with someone else is the only thing that will make him listen, in terms of getting beyond the wall of the depth of his mask. Because she's pretty unmasked at the beginning. She's much further along towards crisis than he is.
Interesting.
Even in that conversation, he keeps trying to manage the conversation to keep equilibrium. And she's scratching her nails and falling harder and harder, which is, again, why I thought she was the protagonist at first, because it's just so centralized around her nosediving. But it's very interesting too. Esther Perel, who's the eminent sex educator or intimacy educator, also says women are far more prone to fantasizing about others than men, which is not what we would believe in the overriding culture. She says because so much about how women are socialized around sex and romance, the narrative is so important and the narrative gets lost. Whereas with men, if they have an outlet for sexuality and they're, they feel relatively fed at home, they can stay more interested for a longer period of time. And so that can feel like a rude awakening. But if you're looking for power, the best thing you can do is go there, right? And so she seems to have, partners know each other so deeply, she seems to have forced his eject button, that really pops him off. And that actually makes the whole movie possible. Otherwise, everyone would be staying in these, trying to uphold all of the structure, the social structures. It seems like she's really done. She wants to blow them all up.
As we would say, this is the inciting incident of the movie. And you're saying she's triggering the crisis on purpose.
She's already in crisis and wants him to join her in a deeper truth.
Do you think her crisis is that she's holding on to that memory, that reality, that fantasy that she once held? What is her crisis?
I feel like that was what I was confused about in the beginning. But it was interesting to me that she's more mad at him and more upset with him when he won't drop his mask than when he's been to see the sex worker, which happens later. Then she's raw still, and she can actually be conversant. She can say true things. So I think my interpretation of the character, what I made all her behavior mean, is that she was going mad with isolation and not being seen for her true self.
I think One thing is that is also true about the film as you watch more of it, as we continue to go through it is from his point of view for the most part,
Yeah.
including in a sense that scene is from his point of view.
Huh. Oh, yeah, it is. Yes.
So some
Watching
of
her
her, the
cry.
strange, I feel like some of the strange behavior, the hysteria is the way in which he might have experienced that conversation, even if that's, in reality, that's not actually what happened. That's how it lands for him. Because later when she shares the dream again, it doesn't feel real. It feels like it's gone through the filter of his mind or something, the way that he's experiencing or seeing scenes. But this rattles him. This idea that his partner would have powerful desires outside of their relationship.
It seems like she's finally gotten through to him.
Yeah, this finally got through to him. And then he gets called away, which kind of gives him an excuse to exit that moment, but then gives him an excuse to stay out and go
Yes.
on this strange odyssey. But before we leave that scene, we could spend the rest of this conversation just talking about it because there's so much there to unpack in terms of agreements between couples, understanding between couples.
That's true. What's helpful in communication, how you actually have those, like
Yeah.
that's a whole separate podcast, but it's important too.
Working with both individuals and couples, a big sticking point is both people recognizing that their partner's desires aren't a threat. You know, she had those feelings, she didn't act on them. She had some sadness around them that she didn't act on them, but she's describing it as a threat. And so I know she's heightening it and poking and creating a crisis. But just because we're in monogamous relationships doesn't mean we turn off desires and feelings and attractions for other people.
Mm-hmm. In fact, it's also true that people in polyamorous relationships cheat.
Right, exactly.
So what's the psychology behind it,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Around our ability to say what we need to really be in integrity with what we're committed to. It's all very interesting.
Yeah, the work that me and my partner do, often it comes down to the two people being okay with the other person's desires and recognizing that allows them to know them better. There's some agreements around what they're doing or not doing about those desires, but like that's the scary piece for so many people.
Absolutely.
And if you can work through that and have some ease in your body around your partner's desires, recognizing it's not a threat to your relationship, a lot of other pieces become easier, we found.
Yes. And part of that, I think, also is about making requests and creating a plan together based on the flow of that energy. Because one of the things that seems most protective in relationships is if the energy is flowing back. So if the energy goes out to another attraction or another, it can be work too. It's not necessarily always sexual attraction, but like another focus. How is the relationship being fed because of it? So again, in my partnership, my partner and I always find ways to bring that energy home. So whether we're just in our mind, like if there's a turn on, then we bring it back and actually make love, or there's also other things like because we both work very intimately with sexually in our work practices. If we do a really heightened session, we'll actually put money from those sessions into a third coffer that's just for romantic dates for us. So again, finding ways to make sure that our biggest powers, desires, experiences that might hurt the other. I'm not saying that there's desire happening there for him. He's being a facilitator. But if I feel raw about it or something, then we put a tip in the tip jar.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So there's this redirecting this energy and using it to bring the two of you closer together.
Exactly. What's empowering the entity of our relationship?
Yeah. So he goes out to see a patient's family who's died and has this strange encounter with the late person's daughter. As it was pointed out to me, from here on in, every encounter he has, people are relating to him sexually somehow, which again makes me feel like he's seeing it from his point of view. It's a kind of dream isn't the right word, but every experience, whether it's this woman throwing herself at his feet or punks on the street throwing homophobic slurs at him or whatever, every scene, people are relating to him sexually. Like he's awakened to sexuality around him. I'm not sure exactly what to make of that.
I'm not sure either, but my interpretation of the same thing was that it was more about what we symbolize for different people. Because there is sexualization, but he represents something to everyone, right? Like with the Russian costume guy, he'd be like, okay, you're the slick doctor or whatever. I'm going to take a lot of your money. Or, for the sex worker, wow, a doctor and someone who's really nice. But everyone's got projections on him for sure that has nothing to do with who he is. and they're all wanting something from him. Like even the punks, they need him in that you look so good, but you're less than us role. And so I really felt for him in this scene. I felt that he did get sexualized, and it's not a fun place to be. I mean, even if our bodies respond later in the moment, it doesn't necessarily mean it was wanted, what you were there for. Obviously, because he does later phone to see if she's around. Again, like you asked me with the scene of the dancing, in those vulnerable moments, we can seek back something that we wouldn't normally want because he's hurt about his wife. And so he does end up trying to connect with that daughter again. But in the moment, he doesn't want it at all.
So this encounter with the daughter who kisses him, and then her husband shows up, he exits, he goes down the streets. That is when he bumps into these punks. I just want to draw attention to like the streets of New York. So they shot this in London, and it's a set. Like, I think this is where he's signaling Kubrick to just be careful about taking this as reality. So if you watch the scenes at the beginning of the movie in the apartment and you look through their window, it's clearly a set. Like, there's just those reflective sheets that have buildings, and they're lit through slits. Like, if you just watch closely, it's not real. When they're on the street, like, this doesn't feel like New York, or it feels like something if I had to imagine what New York was like, someone who's never actually been there, because there's hardly anyone on the street. It's lit strange. There's all these Christmas lights. He's walking the street.
Yeah, there's a lot of isolation.
That's where it's like, it feels like it's his point of view, because otherwise there'd be way more people.
Right.
Even if it is late, there'd be a lot more
the
people
city
on
that
the
never
street.
sleeps.
Yeah. So it's in this isolation he starts to dream about the fantasy that his wife had with the naval officer. So it's like a dream of a fantasy, which he experiences as if it really happened, because we get these quite explicit scenes with Nicole Kidman and this naval officer playing in his mind.
I think that's really common for people. They hear about an infidelity, or they walk in on someone, or there can be heightened realities that we have in our, like, that are misperceptions, or images that are embossed on our brains that follow us around.
So on the street, he gets propositioned by the sex worker, goes into her apartment, and seemingly may have followed through, except his wife calls, which for that moment wakes him up a little bit. And he is kind towards this person and exits, and then he goes into the club, and we see Nick Nightingale, who we haven't talked about yet, but was introduced to him at Siegler's Christmas party, this piano player that he used to go to med school with.
I do want to talk a little bit about the sex worker scene, because I think it's interesting. She seems to be like one of the only characters who's not trying to... She's the one more obviously in the position of just using him, and doesn't use him at all. Like, what struck me is when his wife called, she didn't try to get him to stay, even though it would have been a loss of sale at that point for her. She said, "Do you need to go?" She was actually seeing who he was moment to moment. And when he comes back later to her door to try to see her again, the roommate says, "Oh, you're the nice doctor." So his kindness was felt. He was actually seen as a human being. Now, this is the person who archetypally is only there. It's total commodification. In every other relationship that's supposed to be patient and doctor, your loved one, wonderful friends, like all of these different relation constellations that they're a part of, there's a deep commodification of relationships, using and manipulation. So I thought that was really interesting. She seemed to be, I don't want to go like hooker with a heart of gold on it, but there's something there about her being a bit more pure. This Domino character, her name is called. Yeah.
A little more, one of the more genuine human interactions he has.
Yeah. And then, as you say, we're at the club, right?
Then we're at the club. So we met Nick Nightingale, is this piano player at the Christmas party. He tells Tom Cruise's character Bill, if you can, stop by in the club, and then they see each other again. Now, this is Todd Field, the actor, the director, I should say, who I first encountered his first film In the Bedroom.
Oh.
2001.
Is that Marissa Tomei? Anyway, I know it got a lot of acclaim.
Yeah, Marissa Tomei, Tom Wilkinson, Sissy Spacek, a really excellent film. He's Nick Nightingale, the pianist in this film, but he's directed other films like Little Children, more recently Tar with Cate Blanchett, which I really appreciated. So he's a great director in his own right.
Speaking of Cate Blanchett, it turns out she's the voice of the woman in the mask in the scenes that we're about to talk about, the big...
in the orgy?
In the orgy.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, she wasn't the body, but she's the one she's got this great, like, husky voice. So there's some crossover, but she was never credited for him. I don't know how it came to be, but it's her.
So it suddenly reminds me of other cameos of famous people that aren't credited behind masks. So I'm thinking of Daniel Craig plays a stormtrooper in The Last Jedi. And if you just pause and you just like listen closely, it's like, oh my God, that's James Bond wearing a stormtrooper.
No way. Oh, that's so fun. Trivia.
So now Harford, Tom Cruise, he needs a costume, and that leads him to an encounter at a costume shop. So we have this strange encounter in the middle of the night. He uses his being a doctor and his medical card and everything. So he's a trustworthy character to open up the costume shop. He's going to use his access to money to sort of solve this problem of the costume he needs so he can go to this orgy. And it's a really strange encounter. And then the daughter comes out and she's being fooling around with a couple of older men. There's a bunch of conflict, and this gives Harford a chance again to kind of play the hero, and she hides behind him.
It's a very weird reveal. It's like a smaller mimic of what's going on in the ritualized orgy later. There's two men with painted faces. They're much older than this teenager that they're having sex with, and the father's enraged. So we see the sexual power dynamics then. And so the proprietor doesn't seem to know that his daughter is up to this. His daughter hides behind Cruz, and Cruz does play the hero, but then she's also seducing him a little bit and trying to figure out what he might want out of her. So again, we're in this whole dialogue around who's using who's using what leverage for power, and who is it okay with? Some of the central questions in the film at any given time. But it's very bizarre because it's almost has a carnival feel because the men are dressed up and they are also have painted faces. So it feels a bit surrealist for a moment.
Yeah, it falls in that category of how strange this movie can feel at times, and this is just another example of that. So from here, he takes a cab to an orgy. Maybe the only person to do that at a mansion. I'm not sure, but he shows up in front of this enormous estate, this huge mansion.
My
In a
partner
cab.
and I were laughing so hard, sorry, sidebar, but we were like, that's like one step from asking your mom to drop you off. And and it's also like in the secret society, do you really want a bright yellow vehicle parked outside idly? It's like a bit suspect, but and again, he's incentivizing it. He rips this $100 bill, will you wait for me? And then he goes in.
Yeah, exactly. I just want to mention that I've talked about the kind of artifice of the sets here, and the drive over in the cab was another example of that because they were using rear projection. So he's in a cab that's on a set that's standing still, and the views that he sees that driving by, they're projected onto a screen, either the side of the cab or behind the cab. Common technique used in older films. And this is Stanley Kubrick. He made 2001: A Space Odyssey. He knows how to do this perfectly. And you can feel the rear projection in this scene. Like it feels intentionally artificial. Again, just to remind us that this is something different than reality, either a dream state or something else. But again, he's kind of signaling. So Harford uses the password, he gets in, and then we get this ritual that's taking place. They're men dressed in kind of almost Catholic looking robes. There's naked women in a circle. It's kind of creepy. It looks spectacular in terms of the set design.
It's very striking. Well, there's like this foreboding about it, and there's this papal majesty to it, and there's the difference in vulnerability with the people who are masked and who are standing above, and there's women who are naked and who are kneeling. So there's a lot of plays around power exposure, like who's exposed, who's vulnerable, and it's striking to the eye for sure.
So there's this strange ritual that takes place I found it, the music that's going along with it is very unsettling. The ritual doesn't really have joy in it. It's like they're preparing the women that then the women are handed off to other people, to groups to then enjoy, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, I think why it's hard to put the finger on is because in most spaces the word we might come up with is sacrifice or something, or like the daughters of a certain cult that need to then go do a task. We have no insight except for the structure of the power and who's vulnerable in that space as to why these women are in this role, either these particular women or why women do this. But there's anonymity with everyone else. As we're describing it, the humorist in me is going, well, that's someone's jam. Like this kind of like, are we in Rome and are there girls naked as well kind of scenario. What it brought up for me is the anonymity in sexual spaces faces is a real turn on for people. So Jack Morin, who I often cite because he wrote one of my favorite books, The Erotic Mind, he talks about certain things that are embedded in our sexual system that contribute to our arousal and our sense of fantasy, and what makes certain things compelling for us and other things not so compelling for us in terms of arousal. And so for some people, they would call themselves demisexual, which means like if I really know the person, then my arousal wakes up. That's like when I want to have sex. But then there's this other subset of people that we could call phrasexual. And they are folks who anonymity, really sex with strangers, is a huge thing, and not just as a fantasy. I mean, of course, that's part of it, is sometimes people don't want to act on the things that really arouse them, and sometimes they do. However, with the phrasexual folks, it's actually not knowing the person that is the ultimate arousal. So there's something there for like the power and the mystery and the not knowing who you're interacting with. It's kind of like the extreme version of that would be the glory box. You don't know who you're sticking it to. You don't know whose mouth you're in. And isn't that hot? Right. So we have a little bit of that playing in the scene.
So this is kind of the scene we've been moving towards in a sense. We've had a hint of this for a while. He's been looking all night for some exploration or of desire in himself, and we're here. We're at this ritualistic secret society orgy of some kind. And the film itself has some controversy because there's one famous tracking shot that goes through all the different rooms. We follow through from room to room to room, and we see these people in these robes and masks, and then these naked women also in masks having all kinds of sex on camera. And famously, this was the scene that had to be altered after Kubrick died. So he delivered the cut. He died soon after, but he was obligated to deliver an R rating. And this orgy scene was going to give it an NC-17. And so with a lot of famous directors pushing back against this, the studio then digitally added bodies to cover up some of the sex acts and nudity, so that it wasn't quite as explicit. Most of the time now when you access it in streaming services, you're getting the unrated cut, so to speak. But Roger Ebert called this the Austin Powers cut. So if you've seen Austin Powers movies, famous, there's scenes where he's naked, but there's always a teacup in the way or a couch or, something is, oh, that's right. So there was a lot of controversy around that, but they did that to get the R rating. But again, most of us now can access the unrated cut. So he's at this orgy and he's found out. They know he doesn't belong there. Probably the yellow cab sitting outside gave him away.
Well, actually, I just want to go back for a second about this tableau that we see, because the atmosphere of it is very unique. It doesn't seem passionate. It actually seems regimented. It's almost like the thrusts of different people could be set to a metronome. There's something kind of sterile. There's a sterility in the environment. So while it looks like a moving Grecian tableau of writhing bodies that could be like super sensual, it's not actually that sexy. Like in terms of the energy it's communicating. I mean, obviously it might be sexy for some, but it also brought up for me people who like to spend time in lifestyle clubs, right? Like they love the soundscapes of sexuality around them. They love not knowing what can happen. They love being in a field of complete potentiality where they know that they're set up to go into a sexy environment, but what's going to happen and they don't know. And the anticipation of that is a real primer for their arousal. So I was kind of trying to feel into the different sexualities that might want to be a part of that scenario. But for me, or just as a viewer, not necessarily as a sexual person, but watching this, it was really interesting to see how clinical all the sex acts kind of were. Didn't see like there was any pleasure. Now, I know a lot of pleasure reads through the face, but you can also tell by people's posture and the energy of it. So I find that really interesting, the disconnect.
Yeah, you and I talking about it off mic, you described it as joyless, which I think that's right. Like there is a strange tone to it that just feels sterile, as you said. So as I mentioned, he gets discovered and he's sort of brought before we don't know what their positions are called, but whoever the person is in charge. And we think he's in mortal danger. It's hard to know. And then a woman steps in to quote unquote redeem him. And she's the kind of sacrificial lamb that spares him his life seemingly. And if you read up a little bit about the film, there's all kinds of conspiracy theories about Kubrick trying to out these secret societies that he was aware of. I will say that he's been trying to get this movie made since the 60s when the book first came out. So that doesn't quite track, but there's a lot of people with strong opinions around that and this film. So he gets home, hides his costume, and then we have another scene with his wife where she confesses a deeper dream, a more intense dream and desires. It's still upsetting, but he's actually now able to hold space for her, which he wasn't really able to the first time.
No, but it is still interesting in terms of his character. He is always trying to figure out who people want him to be. So again, he's not divulging anything of himself. He's being leaned on, whether it's his wife wanting to be clear about who he really is and who are you for me, or which is valid. But so far, we've seen the extent of her suffering and him kind of running around behind her, trying to figure out what the heck all of it really means for their marriage, or whether he's being seduced as a doctor, by a family member of the dying relative or things like that. So we see him again in that kind of not sharing his inner world, but just responding.
Yeah, nicely put. Everything sort of shifts after that night. And the second half is him essentially trying to understand and unpack what happened and trying to figure out what happened to the woman that stepped in his stead at the orgy. But he starts to put pieces together, visits the morgue. He has a conversation with Ziegler where Ziegler is kind of warning him off. Increasingly, the mask from the costume ball orgy is this symbol, of course, of what you were describing, the way that he's masking and being unmasked. And there's a moment after this journey that includes a cool scene with a young Alan Cumming, who again relates to him sexually, a really wonderful, fun scene.
Sidebar, Alan had to audition for that 6 times.
Oh,
Kubrick
wow.
is very specific and he wanted it really badly because I think it was like a day of shooting, but he really wanted it.
A day of shooting for Kubrick. That would be a miracle.
Oh, okay. But
It's
not, it's a small
a tiny,
role,
yeah, it's
but
one scene.
he
Yeah.
auditioned
Yeah,
six
exactly.
times.
I believe it. Yeah. And this mask becomes a symbol. And there's one moment where he returns home and his mask, which he had hidden, is now sitting on the pillow. We don't know how it got there. We don't know what that means. Nicole Kidman's character, if she put it there and why, but that essentially breaks him. And he confesses everything at that point and finally is fully unmasked.
There's another bit of tension we haven't mentioned, which is really important when he goes back to Domino's house. And there's another sex worker there. And again, it seems like this is a house of women of integrity because she speaks with great admiration and envy, even about how Domino has talked about the time that she had with him. And she seems to want to seduce and have sex with him, but she does the better thing instead. And then says, actually, she's got this terrible disease. She's gone. And they don't end up having sex. So I just find it really interesting. There's just tiny, tiny corners of people trying to have an amount of integrity, and they're often the people with the least power in the film.
Yeah, I've rushed over the second half, which is, I think, probably unfair to the film. It's essentially turns into a kind of mystery and he retraces his steps. So he goes back to the costume shop where things have changed with the daughter and a new arrangement has been made.
So the father is happy now because he's monetized. He was offended at her behavior before because she was having sex, but now that it's funding his life, he's happy and they're all looking like a big family business.
Yeah, so he makes his way back to the mansion. He's mysteriously handed a note which basically says, stop asking questions. He doesn't stop asking questions. That's when he goes back to Domino's place and then he checks the morgue. And then we have this scene with Ziegler, where Ziegler's using a number of different tactics to kind of shift him. Everything from this is no big deal to fear, scare tactics.
I do love the morgue scene, and I just want to make one comment about it. There's this beautiful moment where he realizes that this woman is dead, that he tried to save her on the earliest part of the film. And he leans forward in such grief that he almost looks like he's about to kiss her. It's like this really interesting blended moment of eroticism and complete grief and complete respect, like honoring sort of the sanctity of life. And I really like, it's the first time we've actually seen in the flesh collateral damage from all the insinuated violence in the film. And that's what stands out. And I think that's why he finally breaks down and he's like, it's some sort of validation for all what he suspected has been going on.
Right. And it's the woman from the very beginning, from the
Go
Christmas
overdose.
party. So then we jump forward, and like I mentioned, the mask is on the pillow. He breaks down and tells his wife everything.
He unmasks.
He fully unmasks. She receives it with tears. And then we cut to this final scene where it's Christmas. There's all the trappings of Christmas. They're at the store looking for Christmas presents.
I really like how that scene flowed into the Christmas scene where they're shopping, because I think anyone in a relationship has pulled an all-nighter in their relationship where they really needed to have a hard discussion with their partner. And you kind of see Kidman go through all these different stages. And then they still have promised their daughter they're going to go shopping. So they're kind of schlepping through. And it's, again, that alienating Christmas environment where it's wonderful if you're on top of the world, but it's bright lights shining in your eyes and abrasive music if you feel vulnerable and you're not sure if your life is falling apart. So again, we have that alienation, what's real, oh, this is so fake, it's not how I'm really feeling. That theme comes back in. So we see his character through the entire movie try to seek power and try to maneuver things with the things that have given him status. And those very same things are the things that are undermining his life on a really deep level as well. His wife doesn't always feel connected to him. He doesn't know what's going on with his colleagues. He doesn't always feel known or felt. He's got a showman in him, which I think is why it's so great that Cruise played this role, because that's kind of one of his most iconic energies, I think, is the showman. But we see in this, we've seen Kidman be in a crisis, but we haven't seen his character be humbled to the point of that kind of spiritual reckoning when we fall to our knees and we're actually accepting influence. And we see him wanting to look to her to be guided by something, because weirdly enough, she's kind of solid in this weird state that they're both in. And so we see him look to her for a type of faith in, are we still a couple, for orientation, basically, about not only their relationship, but about life. What meaning do we make about this? And for me, I think in relationships, we do come in and out of seeing our partner as the enemy at times, and we armor up and we try to provoke them and make them wrong, or we make ourselves wrong. And yet at other times when we've acted out and we can see that this person is still there and they've borne up under our projections and our maybe hatred, they've been there as we've tried to understand who we are, there is a type of bonding in that, a respect that can happen in relationships in a sense that someone has survived us, like the worst that we can throw at them. And so for me anyway, it feels like there's a type of solidarity that comes in, and Nicole Kidman's central message is kind of like, yeah, that's life. It's so loaded, it's hard to really speak to. But yeah, I think it's very well portrayed, because I think sometimes when we fight in partnership and we have this long drawn out period in our relationships or marriages, we just get stripped to our core and we do get exhausted by our own ego and our patterns. And it's only then that we can actually see if we have anything to reinvent or not. So we're kind of with them in that moment.
Yeah, so the film comes to a conclusion. He's reaching out to her, trying to understand if they're still together. And she says, I just want to quote her. She says, so Alice, Nicole Kidman's character, maybe I think we should be grateful that we've managed to survive through all of our adventures, whether they were real or only a dream. So she, of course, had shared some of her desires and the dreams that she had, and that had sent him kind of over the edge. And then he had his adventures, which again, were a kind of dreamlike state. But she's like, we've made it through this, and now we're awake, which is the words she uses. Yeah, she says, the important thing is we're awake now.
And what does that mean?
Yeah, exactly. And she's like, hopefully for a long time to come. And he's like, forever. And that's a word she's not quite able to align to. That's a little too strong a word. Forever, it frightens her, she says. And then this is when the scene sort of shifts to this final statement from her, which is kind of amazing. She says, I do love you, and there's something we need to do as soon as possible. And he's like, what's that? And then she says, fuck, and we're out. Cut to produced and directed by Stanley Kubrick. Yeah, what did you think of that scene, those final lines?
Man, I just think it's brilliant. The resonance that I have with it is a bit like just on a gut level. And it's hard to articulate because it's so deep. But I think the whole movie brings up such an amazing question about what to believe in our own minds and our bodies and our impulses and the possibilities in life, that the infinite potentialities that we have in our life, and how one action can take us down one road, and one choice, one life partner, the choice to have a child, like the choice to step out of a marriage and do something else. These tiny choices make up the sum total of what we experience in life. And life is finite, and our choices do define us. So I really like how the film, and in this last passage, they examine again, what road do we take to who are we? How does our path choice, the choice of what road we walk, define who we are? And I think sex exists in so many dimensions of our being, and this movie really portrays we do have fantasies. So therefore, do we follow them? We had a sex dream last night. Does it mean we want to sleep with that person? I mean, it's really ephemeral. Being a sexual being can be literal, symbolic, it can be spiritual. There's so many ways of accessing our sexuality and understanding it, or our life experience. And so there's something really spiritually provocative that they managed to dig up there. We have central influences, right? Like things dictate things for us. We grow up in a certain family. We get praised for certain sets of things depending on the culture that we live in, our identity, and whether it's fitting with the needs of the social group that we're in. And so how do we navigate the inner and the outer? And in that sense, sometimes we're reacting to something that we're sensing we're allowed to be or not be, because some of it's really subconscious. It's operating on the subconscious, unwritten level, but we can tell what we activate in other people. So there's another dreaming reality behind that. Were we ever controlled? Did we just not try? Who would we have been if we'd stood up and not been shaped by the things that tried to shape us? So her answer, fuck, is just so brilliant, because it almost alludes back, well, let's just say we are lovers for now. Let's do something primordial. Let's not try to clean this up, and let's just get down and do something. Yeah, I think it's a really cool, it takes it out of the esoteric and all the topics that they've opened. And it's almost a joke. It's like a rim shot, like a punchline.
Yeah, it brings it back into the body, out of this dream state, grounds it in their connection to each other. And sex is a powerful bonding force, energy. So they've gone these separate ways, him most recently, her seemingly just in her imagination. And then she's saying, let's bring our bodies together and connect. And I can understand why it would be unsettling, maybe for some people, but I think there actually is a deep truth to the simplicity in what she says there.
Me too. I really liked it.
Yeah, me too. Final thoughts? Yeah, I mean, you just shared some beautiful words there, but any final other things you wanted to bring up about the film?
Yeah, I find their daughter being around but never really being focused on really interesting, because she's a bit of a grounding force in the film, but she's a small piece of meaning that doesn't really get direct attention often. They're often so much in the space of trying to figure out who they are together, as individuals, that the daughter isn't the central focus. And yet it seems like this little flirt in the background, like, you're starting a legacy. She's the new hope, but she's not presented as that. So I was really curious about how they positioned her in the film. And I would say the more I talk about the film, the more I appreciate it. It wasn't something I automatically appreciated very much, but I can, through our discussion, I do like a lot of the layers of what they were trying to look at.
Yeah, I would highly recommend it. And I would suggest to people as they watch it to embrace the strangeness, to go along with it. Just has a weird tone to it. And that's what the director is trying. It's not an accident. It's not a mistake. The film is playing with, besides themes like masking and unmasking, being awake versus being conscious. And for me, the way this couple is kind of a very unconscious couple where they're just following these roles that they're supposed to have. And a lot of us fall into the trap of just kind of trusting the relationship structure that we've inherited. Okay, we're together. That means this is what it looks like. This is how it plays out. And we just lean on the structure. And then the problem is we're human beings and we have all these different layers to us and these different colors and flavors and desires. And so when those come out, it can be really disruptive. And I think the film is bringing attention to that and also challenging us to be more awake and be intentional in crafting whatever structure we want to around the relationships we form. So we're not just leaning on this person's my partner, or I'm married to them or whatever. And that's all I need to think about, but to actually be conscious about what kind of relationship are we creating here? What are the realities of like our desires that still exist, even though we're committed to each other, say in this monogamous relationship, and all the different pulls in different directions. It is like a dream. And I think that's what always makes me lean in, and it makes every scene interesting because it's just a little off. It's not quite reality, which is what I really appreciate about it.
Yeah, it's got some Lynchian qualities. Or put David Lynch in there a little bit. Well said. It's a good examination of all the states of being that we can have as people. And then you add sex in there and it just gets more interesting.
Right. Eyes wide shut. Thanks for the conversation. That was great. Thank you for listening to this episode. Please remember to rate, review, and follow, and please share the podcast to anyone you think would enjoy it. Remember to click the link in the show notes to take my Hidden Relationship Patterns quiz to receive your personalized ebook to start improving your relationships today, and reach out if you need support. Thanks for listening. See you next time.